Close your eyes, unless of course you're driving, then just visualize. Imagine yourself walking along a rocky Canadian coastline. The beach ahead is nearly covered in a dense blanket of fog. The damp, salt air clings to your hair and eyelashes, and it settles cold against your skin. The waves hit against the rocks around you like thunder, and through the fog, just offshore, you think you see something. It's hard to tell at first, but you can make out the faint line of what looks like a ship. Though just as quickly as it showed itself, it fades away into the gray background. But something about the sighting makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Because you've heard the stories about these waters. You know the ships, they hold on to their dead. Some stories blur the line between reality and the unfamiliar. They whisper in the night, waiting to be heard. So let's listen. Let's talk spooky. Welcome back, spooky souls, to a brand new episode. I'm excited for tonight, as I usually am, because we're going to explore a little more about Canada's creepy history. And I know a lot of my listeners are Canadian, and I think that's just fantastic. So I do these ones for you guys. If you are new here, welcome to Let's Talk Spooky. Here we explore the eerie, the mysterious, and the stories that refuse to just fade into folklore. If that's your vibe, hit that follow button and join us every Thursday for a brand new spooky episode. This week, we're heading into the fog to the dangerous stretch of coastlines on both the Atlantic and the Pacific side of Canada, where the storms are untamable and the ships whose final voyages became something of legend. So settle in, light a candle, and let's talk spooky. Tonight, we're going to sail aboard 4 different shipwrecks. Each one met its own tragic end along a Canadian coastline. Our first is the Pacific coast. On January 20th, 1906, travelers boarded an already aging SS Valencia. She had once served as a passenger liner, but had taken a short maintenance retirement. But by 1902, she was back on the job, repurposed, patched up, and pushed back into service. On the morning of her departure, she left port overcrowded, carrying nearly 180 souls, a mixture of families, laborers, immigrants, and crew. And sadly, no one on board ever expected that this would be her last voyage. Over the next 2 days, the liner traveled from Seattle towards Vancouver Island with reports of good weather. It was when it reached about 190 miles north of San Francisco that the crew reported the weather deteriorating, calling it, I quote, thick. When the storm finally hit, the conditions were so terrible that crew said it was like looking into a gray void. Winds howled across the deck, rain slashed the hull, and navigation really depended on dead reckoning. There was no radar, no modern positioning, just knowledge of the route, calculation, charts, and a bit of faith. But somewhere in the night, a fatal error was made, and the ship had drifted too far east. At 11:50 p.m. on January 22nd, 1906, the Valencia fatally struck a reef rock off the coast of Vancouver Island. The impact was so sudden and so brutal that the sleeping passengers were thrown from their bunks. Cargo was shifted, and water surged into the lower compartments almost instantly, flooding the very spaces where passengers were sleeping. Panic spread through the darkness as the freezing seawater rose quickly from ankle to knees. And in order to understand the passengers' situation, it's noteworthy that they slept in a very tight, packed compartments, and the air there was stale and damp, filled with coal smoke and sickness. Ventilation in these types of ships in this era was almost non-existent, and sanitation was even worse. Seasickness swept through the lower decks almost immediately when the ship had hit land. And for those below, there was no horizon to focus on. There were no modern lights. There was only darkness and the groan of the steel around them. And now a deep rushing cold seemed to fill every ounce of the ship. Above deck, chaos reigned. The crew struggled to lower lifeboats in hurricane-force winds. Waves smashed against the hull with such relentless force that it would throw passengers overboard. The Valencia's lifeboats were inadequately equipped for the relentless sea, and one by one they were torn loose, smashing against the ship, swallowed whole by the surf, several even capsizing immediately, flinging passengers aboard into the black waters below. Those who did survive the initial wreck clung to the ship throughout the night, huddled on deck together, soaked, freezing, and listening to the screams of the other passengers fade around them. Dawn revealed their true location. It was along a lethal stretch of coastline with jagged rocks and waves that deteriorated anything that came into its path. There was no safe landing there, no harbor, just endless stone and surf. For 2 days, survivors remained stranded on the wreck as the storm persisted around them. Fear-driven passengers tried to swim to shore and vanished within the waves. And when help finally did arrive, it was not immediate relief that everybody was hoping for, but a painfully slow attempt not only to reach the survivors, but to prevent the rescue teams from also perishing against the rocks. Small boats navigated treacherous waters. Many rescuers had to physically pull the frozen dead from the still living. In the end, out of 180 passengers, 136 sadly perished that night. Bodies washed ashore for weeks after, scattered along the coastline. Some were buried where they fell, and others were taken and returned to their families back home. And some were never recovered at all. But the stories never end there, do they? Of course they don't, because if they did, we wouldn't be here. In the years that followed, the wreck of the SS Valencia had a specific story begin to circulate around it. Witnesses did not describe the distant shape of a ghost ship or the illusion through the mist. They described a single lifeboat, seen clearly at close range. According to repeated reports, the boat appeared at night, most often in calm waters. It emerged from the fog without warning, drifting slowly along the coastline before disappearing just as quickly. But what sets these accounts apart was the description of its occupants. You see, those who claimed to see inside the lifeboats said it was occupied by human remains. And the remains were of skeletons, sitting upright, arranged like passengers, not scattered or broken into pieces, but intact, positioned deliberately facing the shoreline. Several accounts mention fragments of clothing still being present on the bodies, darkened coats, fabric hanging loosely from the bones, as if it had been preserved by the cold weather itself. And these types of stories are expected, right? They're normal. They're part of the lore of these areas. But what if things got really weird and the stories became something real? In 1933, nearly 3 decades after the Valencia broke apart, a fisherman on Berkeley Sound spotted something drifting where it didn't belong. It was weathered, but intact. At first, he thought it was his imagination, that he was seeing the famous ghost boat. But when he got closer, he realized he wasn't looking at a ghost boat at all. He was looking at a lifeboat. And this time, it wasn't in the night, covered in mist and lore, full of skeletons. It was right there, in front of him. The boat was identified belonging to the SS Valencia. Its nameplate was still intact, and the paint, though slightly faded, remained remarkably visible considering it had floated along the coast for 27 years. It wasn't broken apart, it hadn't sunk, and it wasn't resting along the seabed like its mothership was. It remained drifting, as though looking for the shore it never had found. And no, there were no skeletal remains inside, no signs of anything or any people that might have been in it. But to maritime historians, this was an oddity, an example of just how durable these lifeboats really were. To coastal communities, though, it was a bit different. The Valencia had taken more than 136 lives, many of them lost to both the water, without witness, without rights. And now, a decade later, a single piece of that night had returned to them, like a haunting reminder of a tragedy never forgotten. Today, you can actually check out this lifeboat nameplate as it's preserved in the Maritime Museum of British Columbia. And it's catalogued and labeled and up for display. And I wish I had have known this while I was out there, because I definitely would have taken a moment to go check it out. The stories tied to the SS Valencia shipwreck are never completely settled. They linger along the coast, quietly between sailors and lighthouse keepers, folded like the fog. Even though one of its pieces came home, there were still many that didn't. But before we get into our next ship, I want to talk a bit about the area. The Pacific Northwest is lined with wrecks just like the Valencia, nicknamed in the early 19th century as the Graveyard of the Pacific. It's an infamous stretch of coastline that runs from Oregon's Tillamook Bay, past the deadly Columbia Bar, up into the store-lined western shores of Vancouver Island in Cape Scott. Many of these ships were driven off course into deadly landscapes due to weather, miscalculation, or simple human error. Vessels that vanished close enough to the shore have been recovered, but are too far out and too broken to be saved. I had a chance to go to Vancouver Island, and if you haven't checked out that episode about my visit to Vancouver Island, you should do that because it's a cool one. And I got to see some of the areas where many of these shipwrecks took place. And I have to say that I get it. I get why so many of them ended up so tragically lost. The rocks there, the coastline, it's really unforgiving. And I do recommend that if you have the opportunity to venture to Vancouver Island, that you check out many of these locations, because not only do they have memorials set up for the lost souls, but it's just a great way to preserve history. But Let's move on to our next ship and venture a little farther from where the SS Valencia now lays rest. Along the same stretch of water, another ship met the sea, but this time it was a little bit of a different circumstance. On Christmas Day, 1905, the Pass of Melfort sailed to one of the most unforgiving stretches of water, unaware that it would never sail back out. The British steel-hulled sailing ship was navigating the west coast of Vancouver Island during the heart of winter, and that morning in particular, a powerful gale rolled across the open ocean, transforming Barkley Sound into an unforgivable landscape. Sometime during the height of the storm, the Pass of Melfort was forced helplessly towards the rocks. With no modern navigation aids and no nearby rescue infrastructure in place, there was little the crew could do once the ship had lost its bearings. There was no recorded distress signal, no flares, no lifeboats spotted in the water, and when the storm finally loosened its grip, the searchers reached the area, and the coast told the story that the ship could not. Debris was scattered along the shoreline, twisted metal plates, fragments of rigging, splintering cargo, all evidence that the vessel had smashed violently multiple times against the rocks and was eventually torn apart by the sea. Every person aboard perished. Not a single body was recovered intact, and the ocean had claimed everything. What unsettled locals, though, the most was not just the loss of life, but the speed and the finality of it. Other wrecks along the coast left survivors who spoke of the final moments, of screams, of orders being shouted out across the wind, of desperate attempts to save the boat. But the Pass of Melfort left nothing but silence. It was as if the storm had simply just erased the ship before anybody could understand what had happened. In the months and years that followed, fishermen, lighthouse keepers, and coastal residents began sharing quiet stories, not dramatic hauntings that we would think, but strange moments that didn't sit right. Boats passing reported sudden drops in temperature, even on calm, quiet nights. Some spoke of dense fog forming without warning, thick enough to swallow entire beams of light. But the most persistent local legend was that from a lighthouse keeper stationed nearby. And they claimed that on certain winter nights, especially during storms that mirrored the one that destroyed the Pass of Melfort, a dark shape could be seen just offshore, as though rising and falling just beyond where the light reaches from the lighthouse. Not a full ship, but the suggestion that one may have been there. A silhouette where nothing should be. Those who've seen it said that they never approach the shore and it never moves with the tide. It's as though it's just caught in a moment, replaying its final seconds of life. Some nights, the keepers report hearing sounds carried over the wind, low metallic groans of the stress of steel, or faint clattering. And when they sweep the water with the lighthouse beam, the shapes that they see seem to vanish, leaving only empty sea. Locals said that the men of the Pass of Melfort never had time to understand their fate, and then when the ship went down way too fast, that the coast held on to them. Even now, more than a century later, reports of men seeming to walk along the shorelines, confused and unaware, and when locals and tourists approach them, they simply vanish into the darkness. Amphitrite Point holds a reputation for sudden storms. It even attracts storm watchers. And when I was there visiting, which I did get to go, it was very interesting to see the setup they have. They actually have a full open viewing space where you can safely watch the storms. And the local legends there talk of ghosts, talk of ships disappearing, and talk of the sadness that the ocean brings. Because the graveyard of the Pacific, not every ghost walks on shore. Some remain lost in the endless waves around them. Now I want to leave the graveyard of the Pacific behind and venture across the country to the Atlantic Ocean, where its graveyard holds some of the most famous shipwrecks of all time, including the Titanic. But we're not going to talk about the Titanic tonight because I think the Titanic would deserve its own episode, and maybe we'll do that in the future. But this ship was just as tragic. In the early morning hours of April 1st, 1873, the SS Atlantic approached the coast of Nova Scotia. Nearly 2 weeks at sea, she was running low on coal, behind schedule, and navigating through the darkness. Believing they were farther from land than they were, the crew altered its course just slightly, and doing this, placed the ship directly into danger. Just after 2 a.m., the Atlantic struck a submerged rock, and the impact, it wasn't really dramatic at first. There was no single catastrophic blow, no immediate realization that damage had happened. Instead, the ship grounded and began to break apart under the force of the waves. It was a slow process, but gradually water poured into the lower deck, flooding sleeping quarters where passengers slept. Many of them were women and children, eager to return home to their families. Panic spread quickly once the ship began to really lose bearings. Some passengers reached deck believing that the worst had passed. And when they saw that land was visible, there was almost hope surrounding the ship. In the distance, lights from the coastal homes flickered, close enough to suggest that safety might be within reach if they just got off the ship. Tragically, that was not the case. The way the Atlantic was caught, it created almost a riptide effect, and the ship began to be violently ripped apart each time the waves hit. Lifeboats were launched, but the conditions made it nearly useless. Several were smashed against the hull or capsized immediately as soon as they touched the water. Others were torn away from passengers before they could even be fully loaded. Those who jumped into the sea faced frigid waters, rushing waves, and many were pulled under in moments or hit hard against rocks. A small number did manage to cling to the debris and reach rocks, but they had been so battered and bleeding that their chance of survival was limited as well. Local residents who rushed out to the wreck helped as many survivors as they could, and by daylight, the scale of the disaster was heartbreaking. More than 560 people died that night. Entire families were lost. Bodies were scattered along the shoreline, tangled in kelp, wedged between rocks, carried inland by surf. Recovery took days, even weeks, and many of the victims remained unidentified. Burials were constructed quickly, and some graves were marked while others were left in hopes that eventually somebody would come and claim their loved ones. And then time passed. But as happens when time goes forward, legends seem to build along with it. And the coastline that had held so many lost lives began to feel different. Residents spoke of hearing voices near the shore at night. People would describe the feeling of being watched, seeing figures against the rock formations that would disappear within the fog. Others claimed that they would see individuals standing at the edge of the beach line, facing out to the water. And when they look again, they'd be gone. Fishermen later avoided certain stretches of that coastline after dark, saying that it felt unsettled and the wreck had happened so close to land that the spirits were trapped there. Like the Valencia, the Atlantic had become more than just a shipwreck. It had become a place where people believed the dead had never fully left, but they were caught in limbo, in purgatory, between the sea and the shore, never really able to reach either. In the years that followed the SS Atlantic shipwreck, residents living near the island began avoiding shoreline completely. It was not because of the storm or the wreck, it was because several accounts of human figures standing along the rocks became too much for residents to bear. And those who were brave enough to approach the figures had an immediate sense of unease, because they seemed solid until they didn't, and then they seemed to blur away in the mist. There were no footprints, and just an unsettling feeling of sadness. Over time, people began to say that the figures were not really wandering, but waiting for the ship that was meant to reach the shore, waiting for rescue, waiting for their loved ones to return to find them. And if you get a chance to visit Nova Scotia, go take a peek at that area and maybe camp out on the beach. And if you do, let me know how it goes. But not every ghost ship belongs to a single shoreline. Not every ship stays where it belongs. And some ships, they drift, never fully being able to find port. In 1931, the cargo vessel, the Baychimo, became trapped in a pack of ice off the northern coast of Canada. She'd been operating as a supply ship for the Hudson Bay Company when the freezing hull tightened around her. The crew, believing the ship wouldn't survive the ice impact, abandoned ship. Supplies were removed, essential items were taken, and she was left behind, locked among the ice, unmanned, and expected to be fully crushed. But that's not what happened. Instead, she actually broke free. Weeks later, the ship was spotted drifting alone, carried by ice and current and moving through the Arctic fog, and she was fully intact, fully upright, and silent. Over the next several years, report of the Baychimo continued, each one just as unsettling as the other. Hunters, traders, patrol crew described the encounter of the abandoned ship as eerie. Sometimes she was stuck frozen solid between the ice, and sometimes she just drifted along, changing positions, traveling the vast distance without any guidance or anyone to claim her. On more than one occasion, people did board her, and when they found was cabins undisturbed, seemingly left as time capsules, furniture still in place, cargo holds intact, even had finished cigarettes sitting in ashtrays. Doors would swing freely in the wind, equipment remained where it had been used last, and there was no panic about it, just absence. Attempts were made to recover, but all efforts eventually failed due to ice, weather buildup, or sudden storms, forcing the crew to abandon her once again. And each time, the ship would just slip away into the fog. Sightings placed her appearing years later in a totally different place than where she had last been seen. It's very rare to see her nowadays, and most sightings stopped after the late 1960s, but there has been a few recent years. But she has never been recovered, and to this day no new wreck has ever been found. She simply drifting wherever she wants to go, which I can appreciate. But what unsettles people the most about her is not that she was lost at sea, it's that she endured for so many years, even in the cold, hidden by the ice, drifting to some remote waters of the earth where she should have been broken apart, but wasn't. Now, unlike the 3 previous ships, there was no bodies left behind. There were no final screams. Everybody survived when she became stuck the initial time. But there is still an unsettling feeling about her. And witnesses who did board the ship noticed that there was always a strange presence, as if the ship was alive herself, and she didn't want to be found, and she didn't want to be brought back to shore. It was as though she was no longer abandoned, but kind of inhabited of her own. One more reoccurring account involves a sighting at night. And the observer described that as the ship moved through the dense Arctic fog, her outline kind of drew attention, not purely because she was there unmanned, because there was a light and the soft glow appeared inside the ship. Not a steady one like a lamp, but as if someone was passing through the interior corridors, carrying a handheld light from room to room. And this was years after anybody had boarded her. Witnesses watched the light shift positions, disappear, reappear. Some said it paused, others said it would vanish entirely. And when the rescue vessel that had noticed it at first changed its course to investigate, the visibility dropped and the light went out. And once more, she was gone. Some wrecks happen close enough to shore where survival seems possible, close enough where the voices carry, where the light is seen, and there's a moment of hope. Others are abandoned in silence, left beyond the point of rescue, waiting for the ocean to claim them once more. And some, they leave figures standing on the rocks, waiting for rescue that will never come. But there's no clear reason why. Perhaps ghost ships endure because of folklore. They remind us that the sea doesn't always take everything at once. Sometimes it leaves something unfinished, and that something continues as long as those are paying attention to it. So if you find yourself walking along a Canadian coastline and something feels a little different, take a look out, because something might just be waiting to be seen again. And that's where we'll leave tonight's episode. Please take a moment, if you have not, to like, follow, and rate this episode, and leave a comment. If you're a Canadian listener, I'd love to hear from you guys. If you're a listener from anywhere, I'd love to hear from you guys. And until next time, stay curious and stay spooky.